Wonderful. Thanks, Eric. Good morning, everyone. Alicia, Communications Director at Deed. Great to have so many of you with us on this snowy Minnesota morning. A couple housekeeping items. Please do keep yourselves on mute until we ask questions at the end. Just helps mitigate echoes. And if you have any technical issues, you can drop Eric's email in the chat and you can reach out to him for any technical issues. So with that, I'll turn it over to Commissioner Steve Grove.
Great. Thanks, Alicia. I'm here with my colleague, Oriana Casal, our Interim Director of Labor Market Information, and excited to be with you today here to look at the month of October, which for Minnesota was our strongest month of job growth so far this year. We added a whopping 17,400 jobs in October, up 0.6% from September. That followed the addition of 3,100 jobs in September as well. On the whole, the private sector was the major driver of all the job growth. And compared to the US, which gained about 261,000 jobs in October, a gain of about 0.2%, we're outpacing the nation in the last month by job growth by almost half a percentage point. So it was a big month of hiring in October. And as well, October marked our 13th straight month of job growth in Minnesota. So despite another tumultuous year in the global economy, as we've all seen, there is every reason to believe Minnesota's economy is in a position of strength. And this last month's jobs report, I think, adds a deeper understanding of where our economy is at for all of us to take a look at. On the unemployment rate front, we remain at a historic low from an unemployment rates perspective. We did see the rate tick up 1/10 of a point to 2.1% in October. And that streak of having an incredibly low unemployment rate just continues. Nationally, the unemployment rate, as you may have seen a few weeks ago, ticked up 0.2 of a point to 3.7%. So we are still running about a 1.5 lower than the country on unemployment rates. And again, we've been number one in the nation now there for 4 or 5 months, setting all kinds of records there in a very, very tight labor market. Our labor force participation rate ticked down 1/10 to 68% as 4,719 people exited the labor market. We also just got some data in yesterday on job vacancies in Minnesota. The latest data there is for September, about 215,000 job openings in Minnesota right now. That's 3.5 jobs per unemployed person. We are number one in the nation as a tight labor market in Minnesota. That is the biggest gap between the number of jobs open and the number of people looking for jobs that you'll find in any state in our country. And I think it's worth noting that our labor force participation rate has declined for 3 months in a row, just by a little bit each month. So we're down to 68%. We're still about 6 percentage points higher than the nation in labor force participation rate. That fact that Minnesotans work really hard and like to work remains true. But those decreases have continued slightly each month over the last 3. On the whole, though, this year, our labor force participation rate has rebounded by almost a full percentage point compared to a year ago, while the country's is only rebounded by 0.6%. So year to date, we still are growing our labor market faster than other states. It's just that delta between job openings and the number of people that are here remains a pretty wide gap, and one that we are laser focused on here at Deed. You might ask, how could Minnesota have an increase in the number of unemployed people and a decrease in labor force participation rates? We get this question all the time because sometimes those numbers don't seem congruent. The reality is there's 2 different data sets for job growth and employment. There's 2 separate surveys we're looking at. Over time, they get normalized with some revisions, but both the current population survey and the current employment statistics program take different slices here, and we'll have revisions in the future moving forward. But I'll say this, a large job growth month for Minnesota. And I think in particular, when you're seeing a lot of other volatility in other states and other markets across the country, is a good sign for our state. Signs of layoffs, nationally, I'm sure is on everyone's mind here, as you're seeing certainly what has happened out in Silicon Valley over the last few weeks and some other markets as well. We just haven't seen that same type of layoff pace. There are certainly a few companies who have made some moves and laid workers off. But again, with that kind of a tight labor market, employers seem to be holding on to workers as tightly as they can, even if they see challenges on the horizon, because our labor market is so tight. When you look at the data from an unemployment insurance standpoint, our weekly benefits increased over the last month by about 4,000 people, but that is very much on par with the usual seasonal pace that we see for unemployment insurance benefits being pulled down by unemployed workers. In fact, we have about a weekly benefit request amount right now of around 31,000 requests for benefits every week from our unemployment insurance program. Usually that number around this time of year is more like 35 or 36,000. So we're running cold on unemployment insurance claims, which would not indicate we're seeing a big uptick in layoffs. And it's important, I think, for economy watchers to understand the moment we're heading into here. Winter always brings more Minnesotans getting into unemployment insurance, given the weather, of course. In fact, we see one of the biggest swings of every state. Usually in the summer, we're around 25,000 people getting unemployment insurance benefits every month. But in the winter, that pops up to about 75,000. So it's a pretty big swing. We've talked about this in the past as one of the unique dynamics of our state's economy. But with the last few months, it's been warmer and drier, obviously, than it usually has. We're finally getting some snow now, but that has not been the case the last few months. So I think those construction firms have been out working longer and been able to keep workers longer this fall. And I think that's just reflected in some of those numbers on who's taking unemployment insurance benefits and who is not. Orion will get into some of the demographic and gender specific details on those numbers, but wanted to tee up the big picture there. And then wanted to look a little bit more deeply into the job growth over the month and over the year to get a sense for where we're seeing those gains. I'll tell you, the big one in October was leisure and hospitality. 8,800 jobs were added in leisure and hospitality in October. That's an extraordinary number of jobs. Of course, an industry that has had such a challenging time over the last few years of the pandemic is really running hot here in Minnesota right now, which is great to see. Arts and entertainment in particular as a sector was up 24% over the year on job growth. That really drove a lot of these numbers this month. Professional business services were up 4,300 jobs, manufacturing up 1,300 jobs. There wasn't a single super sector in the state that lost jobs over the month. And one that we're always watching closely, just given the pandemic and the years we've been through here, nursing and residential care facilities, jobs there for the first time the last few months, jobs there for the first time in the last few years have started to grow again. They've raised wages by about 13%, and nursing and residential care facilities are seeing that job growth happen, I think, based on the moves they've made to try to shore up their employment picture given challenging times. So that's a good note for Minnesota to be aware of as well. This month also marked the first time this year that that Minnesota has beat the U.S. on job growth over the year. So our over-the-year job growth rate as of today is 3.6% compared to a U.S. Job growth rate over the year of 3.4%. So we are now outpacing the nation on job growth over the year in both the private sector and in aggregate overall. So big picture, we always like to take a look back at this because, of course, we lost over 400,000 jobs at the start of the COVID-19 pandemic. We're now 95% of the way back of getting those jobs back that we lost in those first months of the pandemic. 366,000 jobs back into the market here in Minnesota since that big dip in the start of the pandemic. Lastly, I'll just speak to the inflationary picture here because, of course, everyone's tracking that very closely with moves that the Fed has made and as employers try to land employees with the right wage rates. We did see wage rates in Minnesota go up over the month by 6.1%. That's a 12-month average, I believe, but it is an increase in the wage gains that workers have made over the last month. And at the same time, inflation, as you may have seen, this national number, the CPI inflation index, rose 7.7% over the month. But again, that was much lower than previous months when it had been well over 8.5%. So in other words, in Minnesota, the gap between wages and inflation got closer this month. That's a good thing for workers. It's still a tough market out there if you're a consumer, and we've seen that reflected in some of the recent earning reports of Minnesota companies. But it is on the whole a positive sign that gap got a little closer for Minnesota consumers this month between wages and inflation. And of course, we're all hoping for a soft landing to these challenges as the Fed navigates their next moves. So I'll turn it in a minute to Orion just to share some of the more industry and demographic details and get into some more specifics. But I'll just say this, as we come together here after the election, and this is the beginning, I think, officially of a second term with the Walz administration. We're excited to be here, excited to do this work. We have a clear picture of the fact that our economy has some real strengths right now. There's no question. But we also know where we need work. And it is impossible not to just remind ourselves that really needing more workers in our state, needing to attract more talent here, take advantage of the talent that's available in Minnesota, get creative on automation and productivity are just clear priorities for our administration. Second, I would say economic development is more competitive than ever before. We've got to have new tools in our box and new solutions if we're going to compete for more jobs and more workers with other states at a time when people have choices and businesses have choices. We need to be much more assertive, I think, than Minnesota has traditionally been over the years in attracting talent and jobs in a really dynamic economic marketplace. And last, I would just say, in any moment of disruption, you're going to see more and more small businesses and startups grow. And we have seen in Minnesota that every month now, about 33% more small businesses and startups are being created than in the months preceding the Walz administration's time in office. And, part of that is the focus, I think, that we've made here, but most of it really is just the economic climate that we're in and the opportunity to create new things and see new avenues. And we expect that to continue given the economic picture in the next year. So those areas of focus on workforce development and workers in general, on economic competitiveness with other states and markets, and on small business and startups in particular are really guiding a lot of our efforts here at a really critical inflection point for Minnesota's economy. We've got some good tailwinds here with a good jobs report again this month, but we don't take anything for granted. And I think working together between government and business is going to be so important in the months ahead. So with that, I'll turn to my colleague, Oriana Casal, who will walk through some of the details, then looking forward to hearing your questions. Oriana, over to you.
Thank you. So as the commissioner said, Minnesota added 17,400 jobs in October, seasonally adjusted. That was following the addition of 3,100 jobs in September after revisions. That was slightly downward. This means that Minnesota has added jobs every month for the past 13 on a seasonally adjusted basis. And then the unemployment rate ticked up to 2.1%. With the addition of 4,198 unemployed people. The labor force shrank for the fourth month in a row, down 4,719. That pushed labor force participation rate down 0.1 of a point to 68%. Moving on to unemployment rates by race. The unemployment rate dropped for Black workers in Minnesota down to 5%. It ticked, ticked down for white workers to 2.1% in October, and ticked up for Hispanic workers to 3.8%. Moving on to labor force participation rates. Labor force participation for Black Minnesotans rose in October to 69.1% on a 12-month moving basis. So all of these numbers that I'm giving you are a 12-month moving average. Labor force participation for Hispanic and white workers both dropped slightly. For white workers, it's now at 68.1%, and Hispanic workers, it's at 77.2%. So comparing to February 2020, just prior to the pandemic, Hispanic labor force participation is up, while labor force participation for both Black and white workers is down in Minnesota. Moving on to mail and labor force participation and unemployment rates by gender. So this slide goes back to 2002 in order to provide a longer term look at labor force participation and unemployment for men and women in Minnesota. The labor force participation rate for both men and women lost ground between 2002 and 2019, largely the result of higher shares of people aging into retirement over this period. Women's labor force participation, so that is the blue and turquoise line, the blue line for labor force participation and the turquoise line for unemployment rate, and men are in green. So women's labor force participation leveled off and started to increase after 2012, but was hit hard during the pandemic as was male labor force participation. The last 9 segments of this graph for every line are months in 2022. So men's labor force participation has ticked up slightly throughout the year, while women's has remained nearly level throughout the year. These, again, I should have said 10 months. These are, you should note that, again, these are 12-month moving averages. So actually every month here is more representative of 6 months prior to the month that's shown on the graph, because it rolls 12 months together. Unemployment rates for women have ticked down slightly faster than for men over the year. So moving on to the next slide. As the commissioner said, over the year, Minnesota added 102,931 payroll jobs. That's up 3.6%, with the private sector up 4%. 10 of 11 super sectors posted positive over the year employment growth, the exception being mining and logging, which saw a decline of 5% over the year. Of those showing growth, education and health services rose 4%. Educational services was up 6.4%, while healthcare and social assistance grew 3.6%. And again, the commissioner talked about nursing and residential care facilities. That was up 0.2% over the year. And again, only the second month that showed over the year growth since April 2020. Manufacturing grew 4.6% over the year. In that sector, all published sectors within manufacturing showed growth, though the durable goods sector drove the growth. It added 11,882 jobs, up 5.9%. And manufacturing employment continues to outpace the nation. Professional and business services grew 6% over the year. Basically, all sectors within professional and business services showed strong growth. Administrative and support and waste management services, that's a mouthful, led growth at 9%. And within that, a large chunk of that is employment services or temp help. That was up 7.2%. Professional, scientific, and technical services grew 5.4%, and management of companies was up 2.6%. And then leisure and hospitality continued to post the highest over the year growth of all the super sectors, up 9.2%. Again, as the commissioner mentioned, a lot of that was in the arts, entertainment, and recreation segment, up 24%. That probably had something to do with the warm, dry October that we had last month. And accommodations and food services was up 6.3%. So moving on to our slide that tracks job growth since the pandemic recession. Minnesota lost 417,600 jobs from February through April 2020, and has since regained 376,600 jobs, or 90% of the jobs that were lost during that pandemic recession period on a seasonally adjusted basis. The private sector has gained 366,600 jobs, or 95% of the jobs that it lost. So overall, this means that we're still down 1.4%, or 41,000 short of the number of total payroll jobs that we had prior to the pandemic in Minnesota. So looking at the industry sectors, 5 sectors have surpassed their February 2020 level: administrative and support services, that includes temp help, construction, manufacturing, trade, warehouse, and utilities, and professional, scientific, and technical services all have more jobs than they did in February 2020. Of those sectors, so state and federal government, financial activities, and mining and logging have fewer jobs than they had in February 2020. So those sectors have continued to lose jobs. And of those sectors that were most impacted by the pandemic, other services has regained 86% of the jobs lost. Accommodations and food services has regained 87%. Arts, entertainment, and recreation, again, way up this month, is up to 96% of the jobs that it lost during the recession. And then healthcare and social assistance has regained 91% and educational services 96%. So a lot of those most hard hit sectors are really very, very close to having regained all the jobs that they lost during the pandemic. And then we can move on to wages and inflation. So wages grew slightly faster in October than in September, up 6.1% over the year, although still slower than inflation, which was at 7.7%. So this graph stacks 2021 and 2022 over the year October wage growth. With wage growth still strong and inflation a bit down, these two measures are coming somewhat closer into alignment. We have Minnesota over at the left, we have inflation over on the right side, and we have US wage growth next to the inflation bar. So the industries, the sectors that are beating inflation right now in terms of wage growth, so seeing very, very strong wage growth in Minnesota, are nursing and residential care, construction, non-durable goods manufacturing, and professional and business services. We don't have a lot of detail on professional business services. That's a really big industry, but that is showing very strong wage growth at 9.2%. And I think we can take questions now.
Kavita, over to you, please.
Hi guys, thanks for doing this news conference. Yeah, I was just wondering if there's anything more. I mean, I'm surprised by how big of a number it was for October. Overall, like I think the US and even we had been seeing some cooling down. So I guess is there anything more like that you think could be fueling it? I mean, I think Orion, you mentioned that the dry and warm October may have been a factor there. I think that seasonal hiring, like holiday hiring, is not really reflected in this, right? Because because of the seasonal adjustment. And any other sort of like, thoughts about why Minnesota may be sort of like bucking the national trend and like saw such a strong October, especially when like the Fed is hiking rates pretty aggressively.
It's a great question, and I'm not gonna lie, I was a little surprised numbers this high too. Not that I thought they would be low, but that's a big number. 17,400 jobs is a lot of jobs to add in October, especially given what we've seen nationally. I'll offer a couple of thoughts, and they're qualitative, they're not quantitative. I think one is that the labor market's been so tight here, and employers have had to try so hard to use new strategies to find workers and make those connections that I think some of that's starting to finally kick into gear. You see that in the nursing and residential care space, where finally you're seeing job growth there after so long. The wages have been a big component of that. But as many of you have reported on, and we hear from CEOs and companies every week, everyone's trying new things right now. And I think given it's such a tight market, the desire to get out there and aggressively hire has just remained the case. Supply chain backlogs for many manufacturing companies mean that even with potential slowdowns, there's orders piled up, and when parts finally come in, there's actually still a lot of work to be done. So I think that's a bit of this too, where you've got this kind of stickiness of, sprinting forward to meet pent up demand that's still there, or orders that are on file that haven't been actually fulfilled. So those are a couple of things that I would add. But on the whole too, it is an economy here in Minnesota that, as we've talked about often, is more diverse and therefore more resilient than many other markets across the country. And, it's not like the Valley where everything's tech, right? And you saw the big challenges last week, right? It's not, like some manufacturing towns where that's all you've got. We do have that great mix of industries, and that does prepare us for more challenging times in good ways. And I would just give, a note of gratitude and thanks to the businesses and workers of Minnesota who are making this happen. I mean, you've got businesses that are led by an extraordinary set of CEOs we have in our state and small businesses that are led by really scrappy, hardworking people. And it just bears mentioning that with the kind of business survivability rates we have in this state, with the kind of gumption that leaders and workers have here, it is a different market. And not to be too exceptionalist about it, but I think it is unique in many ways compared to other states. And we'll see. We're going to keep watching these numbers every month, and they're going to continue to, I would expect, fluctuate a little bit, especially heading into the winter.
John, can you just clarify about like the holiday hiring? Is that not kind of really reflected because of the seasonal adjustment?
Well, I mean, holiday hiring would be, typically part of starting in October, probably, in these numbers, but it wouldn't necessarily, I mean, unless holiday hiring is stronger this year than it typically is, it wouldn't be what's pushing these numbers. Some of the industries that are most, that see the most holiday hiring, obviously retail, but also transportation, warehousing, and actually arts and entertainment. I could certainly just take a quick peek at those specifically, but I don't think any of them stand out as having really driven these numbers, with the exception of arts and entertainment, but I'm not sure that we can yet quite consider that holiday related.
Thanks, Kavita. Ethan, over to you, please.
Yeah, hi, thanks. I'm just taking a look at past releases here on just the jobs added, and let me know if it's a silly question, but I'm wondering how revisions might play into this in the future. I know that there have been some revisions, some revised down numbers. So if I'm reporting that this is the strongest month for job growth, is there a chance that could be revised down in the future months, or how would that work?
It's always possible. I mean, but the numbers were so high, and I have to go back and look. Or I'm not sure what the second highest month is after this one, but this was a strong month for sure. And you see revisions. Usually they're not massive. Last month they're about 1,000 jobs. The data's gotten a little more squirrely over the last year, I would say, with some variability. But Orion, you can probably speak to this better.
Well, we did add 17,100 jobs in July. And then we added 1,700 jobs in April. But again, it's been a little bit, with coming out of the pandemic. I mean, we just saw huge swings in 2021 and 2020 and 2020. And so the seasonal adjustment has been a little challenging. September is always a month where, with schools coming into session and the turnover to fall, the seasonal adjustment can be very problematic. October tends to be a little more stable. So I guess we'll just have to wait and see next month what the adjustment is.
Thanks.
We do have time for a few more questions if there are any.
Just add a couple comments on Kavita's question. Retail was actually down, seasonally adjusted, by 400 jobs, or 0.1%. So I don't know that that's that's certainly not what's driving these numbers. Transportation was up. It's possible that transportation companies are gearing up for the holiday season, but that was only 1,500 jobs. So it doesn't look like holiday hiring is really what's driving this yet.
I was just going to point out one other thing. I've just kind of noticed that it seems like every third month there's a big jump, like in July we had a big jump, and then now we're having a big jump. And I think you mentioned April. I don't know. Are you guys reading anything into that, or do you see some sort of patterns with hiring, or maybe they're catching up? It seems like we have a couple slower months and then it's like a big jump, A
great point. We're gonna go ahead, Ariane. Yeah.
I was just going to say there are some patterns that we have discussed with BLS. They don't have a super good explanation for them. Some of this is, so it's really hard to say. But in terms of revisions, revising 17,400 jobs, the revisions aren't going to make that all go away. I mean, That's my prediction anyway. That is still a very big number.
And I also think, I mean, we've been trying to look at these 3-month averages, these averages, and I will just say, I mean, if you look at the fact that over the year, Minnesota is now outpacing the country in job growth by a decent amount, you know, a couple ticks of a percentage point, you know, that is really good news. So we are trying to take the long view here. And when you take a look at that long view, you see a state that has a higher labor force participation rate growth than the rest of the country, higher job rate growth than the rest of the country. And yet, again, one of the tightest labor markets that we've ever seen. So the longer term trends are what are defining our strategy. Month to month, we're going to see some of these shifts. But, you know, on the whole, we're looking at that big picture and saying, okay, our economy's moving, it's humming, things are, you know, largely positive, but we know where the challenges are, and we got to address them with really focused efforts here in the months ahead. And, you know, with the legislative session now feeling all the nearer, we've got both the resources and the collaboration ready to do it. So a lot more to come. Well, I think we're at time. So joining us, really appreciate it. Best of luck. Enjoy your day. And please follow me if any further questions you weren't able to ask here. Thanks, everyone. We'll see you.